8-year-old Emma Hartley's pink sneakers were the last thing anyone saw of her that October evening in 2011, disappearing around the bend of Maple Creek Trail with her golden retriever, Buddy, bounding ahead through the amber leaves. By nightfall, when she hadn't returned home, the entire town of Millbrook would be consumed by a mystery that would haunt them for 13 long years. Detective Sarah Chun had been fresh out of the academy when Emma vanished, assigned to assist the lead investigator on what everyone hoped would be a simple case of a lost child. Now, in 2024, she sat in her office staring at an evidence bag containing a faded red collar with a brass nameplate that read, Buddy. The collar had been pulled from the bottom of the old Blackwood well, 20 miles from where Emma had last been seen by a construction crew demolishing the abandoned Blackwood estate. The discovery had shaken Sarah more than she cared to admit. 13 years ago, she'd been the one to comfort Emma's parents through that first horrible night, watching as hope slowly drained from their eyes with each passing hour. She'd canvassed the neighborhood with seasoned detectives, interviewed dozens of volunteers, and spent countless nights walking the trails with search dogs, always believing they'd find Emma alive. The case had shaped her entire career, driving her to specialize in missing persons, and eventually leading to her current position as head of the cold case unit. The phone rang, jolting Sarah from her thoughts. Detective Chun, this is Marcus. Hartley. I heard you found something. Marcus's voice carried the weight of 13 years of sleepless nights. He'd aged decades in those years, his once thick brown hair now completely gray, deep lines etched around his eyes, his marriage to Emma's mother, Linda, crumbling under the pressure of their shared grief. They'd divorced 5 years ago, unable to look at each other without seeing the daughter they'd failed to protect. Marcus had thrown himself into his work as an architect, designing schools and community centers, as if creating safe spaces for other children could somehow atone for his inability to keep his own daughter safe. Mr. Hartley, could you come down to the station? I'd like to show you something, but I need you to prepare yourself. This might not bring us the answers we're hoping for. While waiting for Marcus to arrive, Sarah pulled out the thick file that had never really left her desk. Emma Hartley's case had been officially transferred to cold case status after 2 years. But Sarah had never stopped following leads, no matter how remote. She'd interviewed witnesses who claimed to have seen Emma. Years after her disappearance, chased down reports of golden retrievers found hundreds of miles away, and spent her own money traveling to follow up on potential sightings that other detectives deemed too unlikely to pursue. The file contained hundreds of pages, witness statements, search records, photographs of the trail where Emma had last been seen, psychological profiles of potential suspects, and endless notes documenting Sarah's own theories and hunches. At the front of the file was Emma's school photo from that year, a gap-toothed smile, curly brown hair and pigtails, eyes bright with the kind of innocent joy that seemed to radiate from the photograph itself. About an hour later, Marcus sat across from Sarah, his hands trembling as he held the collar. His fingers traced the worn brass nameplate, and for a moment his composed facade cracked. This is definitely Buddy's collar. Linda bought it for him when Emma turned 7. She insisted on the red because it was Emma's favorite color. His voice cracked. She spent an hour in the pet store, trying to choose between this one and the blue one. Emma said Buddy looked handsome in red, like he was dressed up for a party. Sarah spread out a map of the area, marking locations with colored pins. The Blackwood Estate. It's been abandoned since the 1980s. The well is on the far end of the property, hidden by overgrowth. The construction crew almost missed it entirely. They were clearing trees when their machinery hit the stone rim. Blackwood ... Marcus frowned, studying the map. I remember that name. Wasn't there some scandal years ago? Something about the family being involved in illegal activities? Before Sarah could respond, her partner, Detective James Rodriguez, entered the room, carrying a thick file and looking grim. James had been working cold cases for 15 years, and the Emma Hartley case had become his obsession. He joined the force specifically because of what happened to Emma, watching from his apartment window as search parties combed the woods night after night during those first terrible weeks. "Marcus, good to see you. Though I wish it were under better circumstances." He sat down heavily, his bulk making the chair creak. "Sarah, I've been digging into the Blackwood family history since we got the call this morning. This goes deeper than we thought." James opened the file, revealing old newspaper clippings, property records, and employment documents. The Blackwood estate was owned by Theodore Blackwood, a wealthy industrialist who made his fortune in textile manufacturing during the 1960s and 70s. In 1983, he was investigated for tax evasion and suspected of running illegal gambling operations out of the estate. But here's the interesting part. His groundskeeper was a man named Vincent Caro. Sarah leaned forward, her detective instincts immediately alert. Caro? Why does that name sound familiar? Because Vincent Caro's son is Daniel Caro. He lives about 2 miles from the Maple Creek Trail, has for the past 20 years. Works at Morrison's Hardware downtown. Marcus's face went pale, the color draining so quickly that Sarah reached across the table, concerned he might faint. Daniel Caro. He offered to help search for Emma the night she disappeared. He seemed so concerned, so helpful. He even brought his own flashlight and stayed out searching until nearly dawn. Linda made him coffee around midnight, said he looked exhausted, but insisted on continuing the search. The room fell silent, except for the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. It was James who spoke first, his voice grim with the weight of experience. Sometimes the most helpful volunteer is the one you should watch closest. I've seen it before. Perpetrators inserting themselves into investigations, getting a thrill from being close to the action, from watching the family suffer. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she remembered that night 13 years ago. She'd been so focused on coordinating search efforts and interviewing potential witnesses that she hadn't paid much attention to the volunteers. But now, vague memories surfaced of a tall, lanky man with prematurely gray hair who'd seemed unusually knowledgeable about the local terrain. Over the next several days, Sarah and James began reconstructing the events of October 15th, 2011, with a new focus on Daniel Caro. They pulled employment records, tracked his movements in the weeks before and after Emma's disappearance, and began building a timeline that would either clear him or implicate him in the crime. Their first stop was Morrison's Hardware, where Daniel had worked for over a decade. The owner, 72-year-old Harold Morrison, remembered the night Emma disappeared with crystal clarity. "Daniel called me around 9 that evening," Harold said, adjusting his thick glasses as he spoke. "Said he'd heard about the missing girl and wanted permission to close the store early so he could help with the search. I told him, of course, go help. He seemed genuinely upset about it." "How well did you know Daniel as an employee?" Sarah asked. "Good worker, reliable, knew his way around tools and hardware. But he was always a bit and tense. Asked a lot of questions about our customers, especially the families with children. Sighed he wanted to be helpful, offer advice on childproofing and home safety, but it struck some folks as odd. Mrs. Peterson mentioned once that he'd offered to install new locks on her doors after she'd just bought a deadbolt. Said he'd noticed her daughter walking alone to school and wanted to make sure their house was secure." James made notes while Sarah continued questioning. "Did you notice any changes in his behavior around the time Emma disappeared?" Harold scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Actually, yes. For weeks after that night, He seemed distracted, jumpy, would start at sudden noises, had trouble concentrating on customers. I figured he was just shaken up like the rest of us. We all were. But then he started asking strange questions about police procedures, whether they'd found any evidence, how long they usually kept searching for missing children. Said he wanted to know so he could help better, but it seemed like he was fishing for information. Their next stop was Linda Hartley's small apartment across town. Sarah had called ahead, and Linda was waiting with photo albums and Emma's belongings spread across her kitchen table. She'd never been able to put them away, she explained, because doing so felt like giving up hope. Linda was a shadow of the vibrant woman she'd once been, her eyes hollow but still fierce with a mother's desperate love. She'd lost weight since the divorce, her clothes hanging loose on her frame, and her hands shook slightly as she poured coffee. "I've replayed that evening 1,000 times," she said, clutching a cup with both hands for warmth. Emma begged to take Buddy for one more walk before dinner. It was getting dark, but she promised to stay on the main trail. She was such a responsible child, Detective Chun. You remember, she never wandered off. Always stayed where she was supposed to. "Tell us about Daniel Caro," Sarah said gently. "How well did you know him before that night?" Linda's brow furrowed. As she thought back, not well at all. He'd moved to town maybe a year before Emma disappeared. I'd seen him at the hardware store a few times when Marcus was working on projects around the house. He seemed nice enough, maybe a little too eager to help, but I figured he was just trying to fit into the community. Did Emma ever mention him? Not by name, but... Linda paused, a memory surfacing like a bubble rising through dark water. About a week before she disappeared, Emma said something that bothered me at the time. She said she'd seen a man watching her while she was walking Buddy. When I asked her to describe him, she said he was tall and had kind eyes, but something about him made Buddy nervous. She said Buddy kept pulling on his leash, trying to get away from the man. Sarah leaned forward. Did she say anything else about this encounter? She said the man asked her about Buddy, what kind of dog he was, how old, whether he was friendly with strangers. Emma said she was polite, but didn't stop to talk long because Buddy was acting so strange. She said the man seemed disappointed. When she said she had to get home, Linda's voice caught. I should have paid more attention. I should have asked more questions. You couldn't have known, James said firmly. Children encounter strangers all the time. You can't wrap them in bubble wrap. But Linda shook her head, tears beginning to fall. That's just it. I did know something was wrong. A mother's instinct, you know. I felt uneasy about it, but I told myself I was being overprotective. Emma was growing up, becoming more independent. I didn't want to scare her or make her afraid of the world. They spent 2 hours with Linda, going through every detail she could remember about the weeks leading up to Emma's disappearance. A picture began to emerge of a child who had encountered Daniel Caro multiple times without her parents. Knowledge at the park, on the walking trail, even once at the library when Emma had been with her grandmother. She mentioned seeing the tall man several times, Linda recalled, wiping her eyes. I thought she was talking about different people, or maybe even making up an imaginary friend. She was going through a phase where she'd create elaborate stories about the people she saw around town. Their next interview was with Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, the elderly woman who lived nearest to the trail entrance. At 85, she was sharp as a tack and had been one of the most reliable witnesses during the original investigation. She lived alone in a house that overlooked the parking area where families often left their cars before walking the trails. I remember that evening perfectly, Mrs. Patterson said, serving tea in delicate china cups. I was watering my garden when I saw Emma and Buddy heading down the trail. Such a beautiful sight. That little girl and her dog, both so full of life. But I also saw something that bothered me. What was that? Sarah asked. About 10 minutes. After Emma and Buddy disappeared down the trail, I saw a man come out of the woods from a different direction. He walked to an old pickup truck parked at the far end of the lot, not where most people park. He seemed agitated, kept looking over his shoulder toward the trail. James consulted his notes. Did you mention this to the police at the time? Mrs. Patterson shook her head regretfully. I did, but I don't think they took it seriously. There were so many people coming and going that night once the search started. And honestly, I didn't think much of it at the time either. People use those trails for all sorts of reasons. Hiking, jogging, walking dogs. It wasn't until weeks later, when Emma was still missing, that I started wondering if what I'd seen was important. Can you describe the man you saw? Tall, thin, wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his face. But what struck me was his gait. He walked with a slight limp, favoring his left leg. And the truck was distinctive too. Old, probably from the 1990s. Dark blue or black, with some kind of equipment or tools in the back. Sarah and James exchanged glances. Daniel Caro drove a 1998 Chevrolet pickup truck, dark blue, and he had a slight limp from a childhood accident. The details were adding up in a way that made Sarah's stomach clench with anticipation and dread. They spent the rest of the week conducting surveillance on Daniel Caro, watching his daily routines and habits. He lived in a small rental house on Oak Street, kept to himself, and seemed to follow the same schedule every day. Work at the hardware store from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m., grocery shopping on Wednesdays, church on Sundays. But there were oddities in his behavior that a trained observer would notice. He checked his rearview mirror obsessively while driving, avoided making eye contact with children, and seemed to have an unusual knowledge of police procedures and investigation techniques. On Thursday evening, they followed him to Riverside Cemetery, where he spent nearly an hour walking among the graves. Using binoculars from a distance, they watched him stop at a small headstone in the children's section, the grave of a 7-year-old boy who had died in a car accident 3 years before Emma's disappearance. This is getting stranger by the minute, James muttered, taking photographs through a telephoto lens. Why would he visit the grave of a child he presumably didn't know? Sarah felt her detective instincts buzzing. Unless he did know the child somehow, or unless visiting children's graves is part of some compulsive behavior. They ran the name from the headstone, Timothy Walsh, and discovered that Daniel Caro had been a volunteer coach for Timothy's Little League team the year before the boy's death. Timothy's parents, contacted by phone, remembered Daniel as helpful but oddly intense about the children's safety and well-being. He was always volunteering to drive kids home after practice, Timothy's father recalled. Said he wanted to make sure they got home safely. Most of the other parents appreciated it, but something about it made my wife uncomfortable. She never let Timothy ride with him. The investigation began to focus more intensively on Daniel Caro, but they needed more evidence before they could obtain a search warrant or make an arrest. James worked his contacts in law enforcement across the state, while Sarah dove deeper into the Blackwood Estate connection and Daniel's family history. What she discovered in the archives of the county courthouse made her blood run cold. Vincent Caro, Daniel's father, hadn't just been a groundskeeper at the Blackwood Estate. According to employment records and police reports, Sarah managed to dig up from the 1980s. He'd been fired in 1984 for inappropriate conduct involving minors and had been the subject of multiple complaints from families in the area. The police reports were disturbing reading. Vincent Caro had been accused of approaching children in parks and offering them candy or small toys. He'd been banned from several school properties for loitering near playgrounds during recess. Most chilling of all, 2 children had reported that he'd tried to lure them into the woods near the Blackwood Estate. claiming he wanted to show them special places where they could find treasure. The pattern was unmistakable, and Sarah realized, with growing horror, that Daniel Caro might have learned his predatory behavior from his father. She began researching the psychology of inherited criminal behavior, reading studies about how children of predators often either develop an intense hatred of their parents' crimes or, tragically, repeat them. "Sarah," James called from his desk. Phone pressed to his ear. "I found him." Daniel Caro briefly moved to Riverside County in 2015, worked construction under the name Daniel Carson. But here's the interesting part. He moved back to Millbrook 6 months later, and there's no official record of why he left or why he returned. Did anything happen in Riverside County while he was there? James's face was grim as he hung up the phone. A 6-year-old girl named Amy Rodriguez went missing from a park in Riverside County in July 2015. She was found 3 days later, alive but traumatized, claiming a nice man had taken her to a cabin in the woods and kept her there. She was too young to give a detailed description, but she mentioned that the man had a slight limp and drove an old blue truck. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. Daniel Caro hadn't just been involved in Emma's disappearance. He was potentially a serial predator who had been operating for years. Working with the Riverside County Sheriff's Department, they began building a comprehensive case. Amy Rodriguez, now 19 years old, was contacted and agreed to work with a police sketch artist. The resulting composite drawing bore a striking resemblance to Daniel Caro, as he would have appeared 9 years earlier. Amy's memories of her ordeal were fragmented but consistent. "He kept saying he was sorry," she told Sarah during a video conference call. "He said he didn't want to hurt me, but that he couldn't help himself. He talked about his father a lot, said his father had taught him things he wished he could forget." Meanwhile, Sarah and James obtained permission to search the Blackwood estate more thoroughly. The property had been abandoned for decades, but remnants of buildings and infrastructure remained. Using ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs, they methodically searched the entire area around the well where Buddy's collar had been found. What they discovered would haunt Sarah for the rest of her career. The dogs alerted on 3 different locations on the property. Excavation revealed the remains of 2 other children, a boy and a girl, both approximately 8 to 10 years old, both showing signs of having been deceased for several decades. Coroner estimated that the children had died sometime in the early 1980s, which would have been when Vincent Caro was working as groundskeeper for the estate. Dental records eventually identified them as 2 children who had gone missing from a town 50 miles away in 1982 and 1983, cases that had never been solved. "We're not just looking at Daniel Caro anymore," Sarah told her captain during an emergency briefing. "We're looking at a family dynasty of child predators." Vincent Caro was killing children in the 1980s and burying them on the Blackwood estate. His son Daniel learned from him and continued the pattern decades later. The revelation transformed their investigation from a single missing person case into one of the most complex serial crime investigations in the state's history. FBI behavioral analysts were brought in to profile both father and son, and a joint task force was established to identify other potential victims. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a forensic psychologist specializing in familial criminal behavior, joined the team to help understand the psychological dynamics at play. Children who grow up in households where criminal behavior is normalized often struggle with their own moral development, she explained during a briefing. Some become hypervigilant about protecting others, developing into law enforcement officers or child advocates. Others, tragically, internalize their parents' behavior as normal and repeat it. The pressure to arrest Daniel Caro was mounting, but they needed to be certain they had enough evidence for a conviction. Working with the district attorney's office, they carefully built their case, assembling witness statements, physical evidence, and expert testimony. The breakthrough came when they decided to execute a search warrant on Daniel's house. Hidden in his basement, behind a false wall that had been professionally constructed, they found a room that served as a shrine to his father's crimes. The walls were covered with newspaper clippings about missing children dating back to the 1980s, including Emma's case. Most disturbing of all, they found a collection of children's belongings, shoes, toys, jewelry, that appeared to be trophies from victims. Among the items was a small pink hair ribbon that Linda Hartley immediately identified as one that Emma had been wearing the day she disappeared. The DNA evidence linking the ribbon to Emma was conclusive. And finally, after 13 years, they had the physical evidence they needed to make an arrest. On a cold morning in March 2024, Daniel Caro was arrested at his workplace as he arrived for his shift at Morrison's Hardware. He didn't resist or seem surprised when Sarah and James approached him with backup officers. Instead, he looked almost relieved as Sarah read him his rights. "I wondered when you'd find me," he said quietly as they placed him in handcuffs. "I've been waiting for this day for 13 years. At the county jail, Daniel Caro waived his right to an attorney and agreed to speak with investigators. What followed was a confession that was both horrifying and heartbreaking, revealing the tragic story of a man who had been shaped by forces beyond his control, but who had ultimately chosen to become the monster his father had trained him to be. "My father started taking me to the Blackwood estate when I was 7 years old," Daniel began, his voice flat and emotionless. "He told me he was teaching me important lessons about life and power. He made me watch while he hurt those children. He said it was natural, that all men had these urges, and that the strong ones acted on them while the weak ones pretended to be good." Sarah felt sick to her stomach as she listened, but she forced herself to remain professional. "Tell us about Emma Hartley." Daniel's facade cracked for a moment, and she saw genuine anguish in his eyes. Emma was different. She was so innocent, so trusting. "I'd been watching her for weeks, telling myself I was just admiring her from a distance, that I would never hurt her. But that day, when I saw her alone on the trail with just her dog," the confession came in fragments, each piece more horrifying than the last. Daniel had been following Emma for weeks, learning her routines and habits. On October 15th, he had positioned himself on the trail, knowing she would come that way. He'd approached her claiming to be lost and asking for directions. Back to town. "Buddy started barking immediately," Daniel continued. "Dogs can sense evil, I think. Emma tried to calm him down, but he wouldn't stop. She got scared and tried to leave, but I couldn't let her go. I grabbed her arm, and she started screaming. What happened next? She pulled away from me and fell. Backward. There was a rock ... She hit her head hard. The screaming stopped. Daniel's voice broke. I never meant for her to die. I wanted to take her somewhere quiet where we could talk, like my father used to do. Tell us about the dog." Daniel looked up with what might have been the first genuine emotion Sarah had seen from him. Buddy wouldn't leave her side. He kept whimpering and nudging her with his nose, trying to wake her up. I realized I had to get them both away from the trail before someone else came along. "So you took them to the Blackwood estate?" "It was the only place I could think of. My father had shown me the well when I was a child, told me it was where he put things that needed to disappear forever. I put Emma ... I put her body in the well, but I couldn't kill the dog." He looked at me with these eyes, like he understood what had happened, but wasn't afraid of me. I took off his collar and threw it in the well, then drove him to a shelter 3 towns over. The confession continued for hours, with Daniel providing details about his father's crimes and his own psychological struggles. He described years of therapy that had never addressed the core trauma of his childhood. His attempts to live a normal life that were constantly undermined by the compulsions his father had instilled in him. "I tried to stay away from children," he said. "I took jobs where I wouldn't be around them, avoided places where families gathered, but it was like fighting gravity. The urges would build up until I couldn't think about anything else." Sarah asked about Amy Rodriguez and other potential victims. Daniel confirmed that he had abducted Amy, but claimed he had released her because she reminded him of Emma, innocent and trusting in a way that made him feel ashamed of what he was doing. "I was getting worse," he admitted. "Each time it was harder to stop myself. After Amy, I knew it was only a matter of time before I killed another child. Part of me wanted to be caught, wanted it to end." The confession was recorded and would later be used as key evidence in Daniel's trial. But for Sarah, sitting in that sterile interrogation room, listening to the details of how Emma had died, the moment felt surreal. After 13 years of searching for answers, the truth was somehow both exactly what she'd expected and more horrible than she'd imagined. News of Daniel Caro's arrest spread through Millbrook like wildfire. The revelation that Emma's killer had been hiding in plain sight, had even helped search for her, sent shockwaves through the community. Parents who had trusted their children to Daniel's Little League coaching felt betrayed and horrified. Customers who had chatted with him at the hardware store about their families now wondered what information they had inadvertently given him. Marcus Hartley's reaction was complex. Relief that his daughter's killer had finally been caught, mixed with rage that the man had been living freely for 13 years, while Emma lay at the bottom of a well. "All those years," he said during a press conference, his voice shaking with emotion, "he was walking around town, shopping at the same stores, attending the same church, acting like a normal person, while my daughter was dead because of him." Linda's response was quieter, but perhaps even more devastating. "I made him coffee that night," she whispered to Sarah during a victim impact interview. "He sat at my kitchen table while volunteers planned search routes, and I made him coffee because I thought he was trying to help find my daughter. All the while, he knew exactly where she was." The discovery of Emma's remains at the bottom of. The Blackwood Well brought closure to a case that had haunted Millbrook for over a decade, but it also opened wounds that many thought had healed. Parents who had gradually allowed their children more freedom over the years suddenly became hypervigilant again. Children who had grown up hearing Emma's story as a cautionary tale now learned that the monster in their nightmares had been real. And living among them, Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the forensic psychologist who had profiled Daniel Caro, was brought in to help the community process the psychological trauma of learning that a trusted member of their community had been a killer. "This kind of betrayal creates a specific type of trauma," she explained during a town hall meeting. "When someone we've interacted with, someone we've trusted, turns out to be capable of such evil, it challenges our basic assumptions about our ability to judge character and keep ourselves safe." The trial of Daniel Caro began 6 months after his arrest, drawing national media attention due to the bizarre circumstances of the case and the involvement of multiple generations of the same family in child murders. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Jennifer Walsh, painted a picture of a man who had been shaped by childhood trauma, but who had ultimately chosen evil over seeking help. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Walsh said in her opening statement, "Daniel Caro wants you to believe that he's a victim of his circumstances, that his father's abuse made his actions inevitable. But I submit to you that millions of people survive childhood trauma without becoming killers. Daniel Caro had choices, and he chose to become a predator." The defense, led by Public Defender Michael Chun, no relation to Detective Sarah Chun, argued that Daniel's confession should be viewed in the context of severe psychological damage inflicted during his childhood. "My client is not asking for your sympathy," Sean argued. He's asking for your understanding that the man who committed these crimes was created by years of systematic abuse and psychological conditioning that began when he was a small child. The trial featured heartbreaking testimony from Emma's family and friends, painting a picture of a vibrant, loving child whose life had been cut tragically short. Emma's second-grade teacher, Mrs. Williams, spoke about Emma's love of reading and her dream of becoming a veterinarian so she could help animals. Like Buddy. Emma had this gift for making everyone feel included, Mrs. Williams testified, tears streaming down her face. If she saw a child sitting alone at lunch, she would invite them to sit with her. If someone dropped their books in the hallway, Emma was the first one to help pick them up. She radiated kindness in a way that was rare even among children. Emma's best friend Katie, now 21 and working as a nurse, described their friendship and the games they used to play. Emma always wanted to be the veterinarian when we played pretend, Katie said. She said animals couldn't talk to doctors about what was wrong with them, so someone had to speak for them. She practiced on Buddy constantly, checking his ears and listening to his heartbeat with a toy stethoscope. Marcus Hartley's testimony was particularly heart-wrenching. He spoke about Emma's morning routine, how she would sing while getting dressed for school, how she insisted on making Buddy's breakfast herself, because she said dogs deserved to start their day with love just like people did. Emma was the light of our lives, Marcus said, his voice breaking as he looked directly at Daniel. Caro, she had this way of making everyone around her feel special. She would have grown up to change the world. I know it. Instead, she's forever 8 years old in our memories. And this man took that future away from her, from us, from everyone who would have been touched by her life. Linda Hartley's testimony focused on the aftermath of Emma's disappearance, the impact it had on their family. People think the worst part is not knowing what happened, she said. But in some ways, knowing is worse. Now I have to live with the details of how she died, how scared she must have been, how alone. And I have to live with the knowledge that her killer was someone I trusted, someone I welcomed into my home while I was desperate to find my daughter. The prosecution also called Amy Rodriguez, the young woman who had survived Daniel's 2015 abduction in Riverside County. Now 19 and a college student, Amy described her 3 days in captivity and the psychological impact it had on her life. He kept apologizing, Amy testified. He would cry and say he was sorry, that he didn't want to hurt me, but couldn't help himself. He talked about his father constantly, saying his father had taught him things he wished he could forget. I was only 6, but I could tell he was very sick, very sad. That didn't make me any less terrified. Amy's testimony was crucial because it established a pattern of behavior and showed that Daniel had been escalating over the years. Dr. Martinez testified about the psychological profile she had developed, explaining how childhood trauma could create compulsive behaviors, but emphasizing that most abuse survivors never become perpetrators themselves. The defense presented testimony from Dr. Harold Stevens, a psychiatrist who had evaluated Daniel after his arrest. Dr. Stevens described the severe psychological damage that had been inflicted on Daniel during his childhood, including being forced to witness his father's crimes and being told that such behavior was normal and expected. Daniel Caro suffers from complex post-traumatic stress disorder, dissociative episodes, and what we call learned helplessness, Dr. Stevens testified. From the age of 7, he was systematically conditioned to believe that harming children was inevitable for men like him. This doesn't excuse his actions, but it explains them. Daniel himself took the stand in his own defense, a decision that surprised many legal observers. His testimony was rambling and often incoherent, switching between accepting responsibility for his actions and blaming his father for making him into a monster. I know what I did was wrong, he said, looking toward Emma's family. I know saying sorry doesn't bring her back or take away your pain, but I want you to understand that I fought against these urges for years. I tried therapy. I tried medication. I tried staying away from children. Nothing worked. It was like my father's voice was always in my head, telling me what I was supposed to do. The cross-examination by Day Walsh was brutal and effective. She forced Daniel to acknowledge that he had made conscious choices at every step, to follow Emma, to approach her, to grab her when she tried to leave, to hide her body rather, then seek help. You had opportunities to stop, didn't you? Walsh pressed. When you first saw Emma on the trail, you could have turned around and left. When Buddy started barking, you could have backed away. When Emma fell and hit her head, you could have called for help. Instead, you chose to cover up what you had done. I panicked, Daniel replied weakly. I wasn't thinking clearly. But you were thinking clearly enough to drive her body to a remote location and hide it in a well. You were thinking clearly enough to dispose of the dog's collar. You were thinking clearly enough to return home and join the search party, pretending to be a concerned citizen. Those don't sound like the actions of someone who wasn't thinking clearly. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning with their verdict. Daniel Carroll was found guilty of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and child endangerment. The conviction carried a mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. When the verdict was read, the courtroom erupted in a mixture of relief and anguish. Marcus Hartley broke down completely, sobbing into his hands as 13. Years of pain and uncertainty finally reached a conclusion. Linda sat perfectly still, tears streaming silently down her face, her expression unreadable. Daniel Carroll showed no visible reaction to the verdict, staring straight ahead as if he were somewhere else entirely. As he was led away in shackles, he turned once to look at Emma's family, mouthing the words, "I'm sorry," before disappearing through the courtroom doors. The sentencing hearing, 2 weeks later, provided an opportunity for Emma's family and friends to deliver victim impact statements. Marcus spoke about the daughter he had lost and the man he'd become in the aftermath of her death. Emma's murder didn't just take her life, he said, addressing the packed courtroom. It took parts of all of us. It took my marriage because Linda and I couldn't look at each other without seeing our failure to protect our child. It took my faith in humanity because I learned that evil can wear a friendly face and offer to help search for the very child it has killed. It took 13 years of my life that I spent in a fog of grief and guilt, wondering if there was something I could have done differently. Marcus paused, gathering himself before continuing. But Emma's death also gave me something unexpected. It gave me purpose. For 13 years, I've worked to honor her memory by creating safe spaces for other children. I've designed schools with better security systems, community centers with sightlines that make it harder for predators to operate, playgrounds where parents can see their children from every angle. Every building I've designed has been influenced by what happened to Emma, by my determination that other families shouldn't suffer what we've suffered. Linda's statement was shorter, but perhaps more devastating in its quiet intensity. People ask me how I've survived losing Emma, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. The truth is, I haven't survived it. The Linda who existed before October 15th, 2011, died that night along with her daughter. The woman standing here today is someone else entirely, someone forged in grief and held together by the desperate hope that Emma's story might somehow save another child. She turned to look directly at Daniel Carroll, who sat with his head bowed. You took my daughter's life, but you also took mine. The difference is that I'm still breathing, which means I have the responsibility to make sure Emma's death meant something. I will spend whatever years I have left working to protect children. From people like you, Katie Morrison, Emma's childhood best friend, spoke about the impact of losing someone so young and the way it had shaped her own life choices. Emma wanted to be a veterinarian, Katie said, but I became a nurse instead. I work in pediatrics. Now and every day I see children who remind me of Emma, their curiosity, their trust, their boundless capacity for joy. I became a nurse because Emma can't become a veterinarian, because someone has to speak for those who can't speak for themselves. Mrs. Williams, Emma's second-grade teacher, had retired years earlier, but had remained active in child advocacy. In 30 years of teaching, she said, I've seen thousands of children pass through my classroom. But Emma Hartley was special in a way that transcends my ability to describe it. She had an old soul wrapped up in a child's body, a wisdom beyond. Her years combined with a kind of innocence that makes childhood magical. When someone like Emma is taken from the world, we all become poorer for it. The most unexpected testimony came from Amy Rodriguez, who had traveled from California to attend the sentencing. Now a college sophomore studying psychology, Amy spoke about her own journey from victim to advocate. I was 6 years old when Daniel Caro abducted me, she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was sharing. For years, I was angry that Emma hadn't been as lucky as I was, that she didn't get to grow up and become who she was meant to be. But over time, I've come to understand that Emma's story and my story are connected in ways that go beyond just sharing the same perpetrator. Amy looked toward Emma's family as she continued. Emma's death saved my life in a way. If Daniel hadn't killed her, if he hadn't been consumed by guilt and fear after what happened to her, I don't think he would have let me go. Emma's story also inspired me to study psychology, to try to understand how someone becomes capable of such evil, and whether there are ways to identify and help potential predators before they hurt children. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, who had been working with both families throughout the trial process, spoke about the ripple effects of child murder on entire communities. Emma's death didn't just impact her immediate family, she testified. It changed the fundamental nature of life in Millbrook. Parents became more protective. Children lost some of their natural sense of safety and exploration, and the entire community had to grapple with the reality that evil could be hiding in plain sight. Finally, Daniel Caro himself was given the opportunity to address the court before sentencing. He stood slowly, his orange jumpsuit hanging loose on his diminished frame, and spoke in a voice that was barely audible. I know that nothing I say can undo what I've done or bring Emma back. He began. I know that my apologies are worthless to her family, and that my explanations about my childhood sound like excuses. But I want to say something anyway, not for forgiveness, because I don't deserve that, but because I think Emma would want me to tell the truth. Daniel paused, seeming to gather courage before continuing. My father made me into a monster, but I chose to remain one. I had opportunities to get help, to break the cycle, to be different than he was. Instead, I gave in to the voices in my head that told me hurting children was inevitable. Emma Hartley was innocent and beautiful and full of life, and I took all of that away because I was too weak to fight my own demons. He looked directly at Marcus and Linda for the first time during the entire proceedings. I don't ask for your forgiveness because I don't deserve it, but I want you to know that not a day has passed since October 15th, 2011, that I haven't thought about Emma. Not a day has passed that I haven't wished I could trade places with her, that I could give back what I took. If there's any justice in the universe, I'll spend eternity paying for what I did to your daughter. Judge Patricia Hawkins, who had presided over the trial with quiet dignity, delivered Daniel's sentence with the weight of 13 years of community grief behind her words. Daniel Caro, you have been found guilty of the first-degree murder of Emma Marie Hartley, a crime that has shattered a family and traumatized an entire community. While I acknowledge the difficult circumstances of your own childhood, I cannot and will not allow those circumstances to excuse or minimize the gravity of your actions." She continued, "Emma Hartley was 8 years old when you took her life. She should have grown up to graduate from high school, attend college, pursue her dreams of becoming a veterinarian, fall in love, perhaps have children of her own. Instead, she will remain forever 8 years old in the memories of those who loved her. You are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. May God have mercy on your soul, because this court cannot." The aftermath of Daniel Carroll's conviction and sentencing marked the beginning of a new chapter for Millbrook and for Emma's family. The revelation that Emma's killer had been living among them for 13 years forced the community to confront uncomfortable truths about their assumptions and prejudices. Father Michael O'Brien, the pastor of St. Mary's Catholic Church, where Daniel had been a regular attendee, struggled with his own feelings of guilt and responsibility. Daniel sat in my pews every Sunday for over a decade, Father O'Brien said during a community healing service. He participated in church activities, volunteered for charity drives, seemed like any other parishioner seeking spiritual guidance. How did I miss the signs? How did we all miss them? Dr. Martinez, who had remained in Millbrook to help the community, processed the psychological trauma of the revelation, addressed these concerns during a series of public forums. Predators are skilled at hiding in plain sight, she explained. They often go out of their way to appear helpful, trustworthy, and normal. The fact that a community didn't recognize a predator doesn't indicate failure on their part. It indicates the sophisticated nature of predatory behavior. The discovery of additional remains at the Blackwood estate had opened up cold cases dating back to the 1980s, and families who had lost children decades earlier finally began to get answers. The parents of the 2 children found buried on the estate: Tommy Morrison, age 8, who disappeared in 1982, and Sarah Chun, age 9, who vanished in 1983, had never given up hope of finding their children. Tommy Morrison's mother, Margaret, was now 78 years old and had spent 42 years wondering what had happened to her son. "I used to lie awake at night, imagining him growing up somewhere else, maybe adopted by a family who loved him," she said during an interview with local news. "I never wanted to believe he was dead, even when logic told me he must be. But now I can finally lay him to rest properly." Sarah Chun's father, Detective Sarah Chun's Uncle David, had become a police officer specifically because of what happened to his daughter. The irony that his niece had solved the case involving his own child's murder was not lost on him. "Sarah always said she wanted to help find missing children," David said, tears streaming down his weathered face. "I never imagined she would end up finding her own cousin." The investigation into Vincent Carrow's crimes revealed a pattern of predatory behavior that had gone undetected for years. Working with FBI behavioral analysts, Sarah and James were able to connect Vincent to at least 6 other child disappearances in the region during the 1970s and 1980s. The scope of the family's crimes was staggering. Across 2 generations, the Carrows were responsible for the deaths of at least 9 children. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, a criminologist from the State University, was granted access to interview Daniel Carroll in prison as part of her research into familial criminal behavior. Her conversations with him, conducted over a period of months, revealed disturbing details about how Vincent had systematically groomed his own son to become a predator. Vincent Carroll didn't just abuse his son, Dr. Harper explained in her subsequent research paper. He methodically destroyed Daniel's moral compass and replaced it with a twisted worldview that normalized violence against children. Daniel was, in many ways, as much a victim of his father as the children he later killed, but that doesn't diminish his responsibility for choosing to continue the cycle of violence. The interviews revealed that Vincent had forced Daniel to participate in the burial of victims at the Blackwood estate, telling him it was a family responsibility, and that keeping the secret proved Daniel's loyalty and love. Daniel described being 7 years old and helping his father carry small bodies to the well, all while being told that this was normal behavior that all fathers and sons engaged in. My father convinced me that every family had secrets like ours. Daniel told Dr. Harper during one recorded session. He said the difference between strong families and weak ones was that strong families protected their secrets, no matter what. He made me believe that turning him in or telling anyone would destroy our family, and that I would be alone in the world. As Daniel grew older, Vincent began taking him on hunting trips, their code name for stalking potential victims. Vincent taught Daniel how to identify vulnerable children, how to approach them without seeming threatening, and how to gain their trust. By the time Daniel was a teenager, he was actively participating in his father's crimes. The worst part, Daniel confided during one session, was that part of me knew it was wrong. There was always a voice in my head screaming that we were monsters, that what we were doing was evil. But my father's voice was louder, and he was all I had. He told me that if I ever tried to stop him or expose him, he would kill me and Mick. It looked like an accident. Vincent Caro had died of a heart attack in 1998 when Daniel was 26 years old. For several years after his father's death, Daniel had tried to live a normal life, moving to different towns and attempting to suppress the compulsions his father had instilled in him. But the psychological conditioning proved too strong to overcome without professional help, which Daniel was too ashamed and frightened to seek. After my father died, I thought I was free, Daniel explained. I thought the urges would go away if I just tried hard enough to be normal. I got legitimate jobs, went to church, tried to convince myself I could be a good person. But the thoughts never stopped. The need to be around children, to have power over them, it was like an addiction. The harder I tried to fight it, the stronger it became. The revelation of the full scope of the Caro family crimes led to a comprehensive review of missing children cases across the entire region. Cold case units from multiple jurisdictions worked together to identify potential victims and notify families. The process was painstaking and often heartbreaking, as families who had spent decades wondering about their missing children finally learned the truth. One of the most significant developments came when authorities in 3 different states connected Vincent Caro to a series of child abductions that had occurred during the late 1970s. Working as a traveling handyman during that period, Vincent had crisscrossed the region, leaving a trail of missing children in his wake. The Morrison family, whose 8-year-old son Tommy had been found buried at the Blackwood estate, decided to establish a memorial foundation in their son's honor. The Tommy Morrison Foundation focused on supporting families of missing children and funding research into predatory behavior. Tommy would be 50 years old now if that monster hadn't taken his life, Margaret Morrison said during the foundation's launch. He'd probably have children of his own, maybe grandchildren. Instead, we have 42 years of wondering, and now this terrible knowledge. But if Tommy's story can help prevent other families from going through what we've endured, then maybe his death will have some meaning. Asterisk, the psychological impact of learning about the full extent of the Caro family crimes reverberated through all the affected communities. Parents who had raised children during the 1970s and 1980s realized how close their own families might have come to tragedy. Children who were now adults remembered encounters with friendly handymen or helpful strangers who fit Vincent Caro's description. Dr. Martinez established a support group for families affected by the Caro crimes, both directly and indirectly. The group met weekly at the Millbrook Community Center, providing a space for people to process their feelings about living in communities where such evil had operated undetected for so long. Survivor's guilt is common in these situations, Dr. Martinez explained. People feel guilty that their children were spared while others weren't. They feel guilty that they didn't recognize the signs or do something to stop it. These feelings are normal, but can be destructive if not addressed properly. Sarah Chun found herself struggling with her own complex emotions about the case. Solving. Emma's murder had been the defining achievement of her career, but learning that her own cousin had been one of Vincent Caro's victims added a deeply personal dimension to the investigation. I became a police officer because of what happened to my cousin Sarah, she told her captain during a performance review. But I never imagined I would be the one to solve her case. It's giving me closure I didn't even know I needed, but it's also opened up old wounds that I thought had healed. Marcus and Linda Hartley, brought together by the resolution of their daughter's case and the need to support each other through the trial and its aftermath, began attending grief counseling together. They didn't remarry, but they found a way to communicate and cooperate that had been impossible during the years when Emma's fate was unknown. Knowing what happened to Emma is horrible, Linda said during one of their joint counseling sessions. But not knowing was worse. At least now we can grieve properly, and we can work together to make sure her story helps other children. Marcus had thrown himself into his architectural work with renewed purpose, designing buildings that incorporated lessons learned from Emma's case. His designs featured improved lighting, better sightlines, and security measures that could help prevent child abductions without creating prison-like environments. Every school I design now includes Emma's rules, Marcus explained to a conference of architects and school administrators. Natural surveillance areas where children are always visible to adults, secure but not intimidating pickup and drop-off zones, and emergency communication systems that can lock down a building in seconds if needed. The Emma Hartley Foundation, established jointly by Marcus and Linda, became one of the most effective child safety organizations in the region. The foundation's programs included safety education for children, training for parents and teachers on recognizing predatory behavior, and support services for families dealing with missing children. One of the Foundation's most innovative programs was the Buddy System Initiative, named after Emma's beloved dog. The program trained therapy dogs to work with children who had experienced trauma, while also educating kids about how pets could serve as early warning systems for dangerous situations. Buddy tried to protect Emma, Linda explained during a program demonstration. Dogs have instincts about people that we should pay attention to. If a child's pet is uncomfortable around someone, that's a red flag that should be taken seriously. The program featured Rusty, the golden retriever who had been Emma's buddy, now elderly but still energetic enough to participate in educational presentations. The Morrison family, who had cared for Rusty for 13 years, had worked out an arrangement with the Hartleys where Rusty could spend time with both families and also participate in the Foundation's work. Rusty's presence at school visits and community events had a profound impact on children and adults alike. His gentle nature and obvious intelligence made him an effective ambassador for the Foundation's message, while his connection to Emma's story gave presentations an emotional weight that statistics and lectures couldn't match. During one particularly moving presentation at Millbrook Elementary School, a 7-year-old girl asked Linda if Rusty missed Emma. Linda knelt down to the child's level and said, "I think Rusty carries Emma's love with him wherever he goes. When you pet Rusty, you're feeling some of that love too." The success of the Foundation's programs led to invitations to expand their work to other communities. Within 2 years of Daniel Caro's conviction, the Emma Hartley Foundation was operating programs in 6 different states, training thousands of children, parents, and professionals in child safety and predator recognition. Dr. Harper's research into the Caro family crimes resulted in a book titled Inherited Evil: How Criminal Behavior Passes Through Generations. The book became required reading in criminal justice programs across the country and helped law enforcement agencies develop better strategies for identifying and investigating familial criminal enterprises. The Caro case demonstrates that evil isn't born in a vacuum, Dr. Harper wrote in her conclusion. It's cultivated, nurtured, and passed down like a twisted family legacy. Understanding how this process works is crucial for breaking these cycles and preventing future victims. The book also examined the role of community awareness in preventing crimes against children. Dr. Harper argued that many of the warning signs exhibited by both Vincent and Daniel Caro had been visible to observant community members, but those observations hadn't been reported or taken seriously. Communities have a responsibility to protect their children that goes beyond individual parental vigilance. She wrote, "When we see behavior that makes us uncomfortable, when someone seems too interested in children or too eager to volunteer for child-focused activities, we need to trust our instincts and report our concerns to appropriate authorities." 3 years after Daniel Caro's conviction, the state legislature passed the Emma Hartley Child Protection Act, which mandated background checks for all volunteers working with children and established new protocols for investigating suspicious behavior around schools and playgrounds. The law also created a statewide database for tracking individuals who had been the subject of multiple complaints about inappropriate behavior toward children, even if those complaints hadn't resulted in criminal charges. The database was designed to help law enforcement agencies identify patterns of concerning behavior that might indicate predatory tendencies. Emma's Law, as it became known, faced opposition from civil liberties groups who worried about false accusations and privacy violations. But the legislation ultimately passed with strong support from child advocacy organizations and families affected by crimes like Emma's. Linda Hartley testified before the legislature in support of the bill, carrying a photograph of Emma that had been taken just days before her disappearance. "This picture shows my daughter as she was meant to be, happy, safe, full of life and potential," Linda told the assembled lawmakers. Laws like this won't bring Emma back, but they might prevent other families from losing their children to predators who hide in plain sight. The passage of Emma's Law marked a turning point in how the state approached child protection, shifting from a reactive model that only intervened after crimes had been committed to a proactive approach that tried to identify and address concerning behavior before it escalated to violence. Detective James Rodriguez, who had retired shortly after Daniel Caro's conviction, was asked to serve as a consultant for the state's new Child Protection Task Force. His experience with the Emma Hartley case and his knowledge of how predators operated made him invaluable in developing new investigative protocols. The hardest part about cases like Emma's, Rodriguez explained during a training session for new detectives, is that predators often don't look or act like monsters. They look like helpful neighbors, concerned volunteers, upstanding community members. They've learned to mimic normal behavior so well that they can fool even experienced investigators. The training program Rodriguez helped develop included modules on recognizing subtle signs of predatory behavior, understanding the psychology of familial criminal enterprises, and maintaining long-term investigations into cold cases. The program became a model for law enforcement agencies across the country. Sarah Chun, now in her late 30s and one of the state's most respected cold case investigators, found herself in high demand as a speaker and consultant. Her experience with the Emma Hartley case had taught her valuable lessons about persistence, community engagement, and the importance of never giving up on seemingly hopeless cases. "The Emma Hartley case taught me that no case is ever truly cold," she would tell audiences of law enforcement officers, victim advocates, and community leaders. As long as someone cares about the victim, as long as someone is willing to keep asking questions and following leads, there's always hope for resolution. Sarah's own unit had solved 12 other cold cases in the 3 years since Daniel Caro's conviction, using techniques and approaches developed during the Emma investigation. Each success brought closure to families who had been waiting years or even decades for answers about their missing loved ones. One of those cases involved the 1987 disappearance of 6-year-old Michael Chun, no relation to Sarah, whose remains were discovered during a construction project in a town 30 miles from Millbrook. Using methods pioneered during the Emma investigation, Sarah's team was able to connect the case to a convicted child molester who had died in prison years earlier. Michael's parents, now in their 70s, had never given up hope finding their son. The discovery of his remains was devastating, but also brought them a peace they hadn't experienced in over 30 years. "We always knew Michael was gone," his mother said during a press conference announcing the case's resolution. "But not knowing where he was, not being able to lay him to rest properly, was torture. Detective Chun and her team gave us the chance to say goodbye to our son. That's a gift we can never repay." The success of Sarah's cold case unit led to increased funding and expanded jurisdiction, allowing the team to investigate missing persons cases throughout the region. The unit became a model for other states dealing with their own backlogs of unsolved cases. 5 years after Emma's remains were found, Millbrook dedicated a new playground in her honor. The playground featured equipment designed to be accessible to children with disabilities, reflecting Emma's inclusive spirit that her teacher and friends had described during the trial. The playground was built on land donated by the Morrison family, whose hardware store had employed Daniel Caro. Harold Morrison, now in his late 70s, had struggled with guilt about employing Emma's killer and had sought ways to make amends to the community. "We can't undo the past," Morrison said during the playground's dedication ceremony, "but we can try to create something positive from something terrible." This playground isn't just about remembering Emma. It's about celebrating the joy and innocence that children represent. The dedication ceremony drew hundreds of people from Millbrook and surrounding communities, children who had never known. Emma played on equipment designed to honor her memory, their laughter providing a bittersweet soundtrack to the speeches and remembrances. Marcus Hartley spoke to the crowd about the daughter he had lost and the community that had supported his family through their darkest years. "Emma loved playgrounds," he said, watching children already beginning to explore the new equipment. "She would have loved knowing that children for generations to come will play here, laugh here, make memories here." Linda Hartley, now working as a victim's advocate for the state attorney general's office, spoke about finding purpose in tragedy. "Emma's story didn't end when she died," she said. "It transformed. It became bigger than one little girl walking her dog on an October evening. It became a force for change, a catalyst for healing, a reminder that love is stronger than loss." The ceremony also marked the unveiling of a bronze memorial statue featuring Emma and Buddy, captured in a moment of pure joy as they walked together down a trail. The statue was created by local artist Rebecca Santos, who had been deeply moved by Emma's story and had donated her time and materials to the project. "I wanted to capture Emma as she lived, not as she died," Santos explained to reporters. "This statue shows a happy child and her beloved dog exploring the world together with trust and wonder. That's how Emma should be remembered." The memorial also included a time capsule filled with letters from children around the world who had heard Emma's story and wanted to contribute to her memory. The letters, written in dozens of languages, shared common themes of hope, safety, and the importance of protecting children. One letter from a 9-year-old girl in Japan read, "Dear Emma, I heard about what happened to you, and I'm sorry you couldn't grow up like me. I promise to be extra careful when I'm walking my dog, and I'll remember to listen when my dog tries to tell me something is wrong. I hope you and Buddy are playing together somewhere happy." Dr. Martinez, who had continued working with the families affected by the Caro crimes, spoke at the ceremony about the power of community healing. Trauma can either divide a community or bring it together, she said. Millbrook chose to come together, to transform their pain into purpose, their grief into action. Emma's memory has become a source of strength rather than just sorrow. The playground dedication was followed by the 5th annual Emma Hartley Memorial 5K, which had become one of the region's largest fundraising events for child safety programs. Participants included families from across the state, law enforcement officers, and survivors of child crimes who had found inspiration in Emma's story. Rusty, now nearly 18 years old, but still spry enough for special occasions, served as the honorary starter for the race. Wearing a special red collar that matched the one he'd worn as Buddy, he touched the starting line with his paw to begin the race, drawing cheers and tears from the assembled crowd. The race route took participants past many of the locations that had been significant in Emma's story: the hardware store where Daniel Caro had worked, the trail where Emma had last been seen, and the community center where search parties had gathered during those desperate first days after her disappearance. For many participants, the race was about more than just honoring Emma's memory. It was a celebration of survival, resilience, and the community's refusal to let evil have the final word. Amy Rodriguez, now 24 and working as a child psychologist in California, returned to Millbrook each year for the memorial race. Her participation had become symbolic of hope and healing, proof that survivors could not only overcome trauma, but use their experiences to help others. "Running this race reminds me why I survived," Amy said during a pre-race interview. "I didn't survive just for myself. I survived to be a voice for children who can't speak for themselves, to help families heal from trauma, and to honor Emma's memory by living the life she wasn't able to live." The race raised over $200,000 in its 5th year, funds that were distributed to child safety programs, victim support services, and research into predatory behavior. The success of the event had inspired similar memorial races in other communities, creating a network of support for families dealing with child crimes. As the years passed, Emma's story became part of the fabric of Millbrook's identity. New residents learned about the little girl who had been taken too soon, and longtime residents found ways to keep her memory alive in their daily lives. The elementary school where Emma had been a student established an annual Emma Hartley Kindness Award given to students who exemplified the inclusive, caring spirit that Emma had shown during her brief life. Winners of the award received a small golden retriever pin and the opportunity to help care for the school's therapy dog, a program inspired by Emma's relationship with Buddy. Local businesses found their own ways to honor Emma's memory. The library created a special reading garden where children could sit with therapy dogs while reading, and the Park Service installed educational signs along the Maple Creek Trail with information about staying safe while enjoying nature. Dr. Elizabeth Harper's research into the Caro family crimes continued to yield insights that helped law enforcement agencies understand and prevent familial criminal enterprises. Her work had identified similar patterns in cases across the country, leading to the arrest and conviction of several other multi-generational criminal families. The Emma Hartley case opened our eyes to a type of criminal behavior that had been largely overlooked, Dr. Harper explained during a conference on child protection. "We now know that some of the most dangerous predators aren't isolated individuals, but members of families where criminal behavior has been normalized and passed down through generations." Her research had also led to the development of new therapeutic approaches for children who had been exposed to familial criminal behavior. These programs focused on breaking cycles of trauma and helping young victims understand that they weren't destined to repeat their family's patterns of behavior. Daniel Caro, serving his life sentence in state prison, had reportedly become a model prisoner, participating in therapy programs and educational classes. According to his counselor, He had expressed genuine remorse for his actions and had become an advocate for recognizing and treating childhood trauma to prevent future cycles of abuse. Daniel understands that his childhood doesn't excuse what he did, the counselor reported during his annual review. But he also understands that breaking the cycle of abuse requires acknowledgement, treatment, and constant vigilance. He's dedicated his incarceration to understanding himself and helping other inmates recognize similar patterns in their own lives. Caro had written letters of apology to Emma's family and to Amy Rodriguez, though neither family had chosen to read them. He had also participated in research studies aimed at understanding how childhood trauma can lead to criminal behavior, hoping that his experiences might help prevent future tragedies. His cooperation with researchers had contributed to new understanding about the psychology of inherited criminal behavior, but it didn't diminish the severity of his crimes or the impact they had on his victims and their families. On what would have been Emma's 21st birthday, her family held a celebration of life at the memorial garden. Instead of mourning what might have been, they focused on the positive changes that had come from Emma's story, the foundation that had helped hundreds of families, the safety programs that had educated thousands of children, and the cold case unit that had solved dozens of other long-dormant mysteries. "We'll never know what Emma might have become if she'd lived to adulthood," Marcus said, standing beside the bronze statue that captured his daughter's joy so perfectly. "But we can see what she became in death, a symbol of hope, a call to action, a reminder that every child's life has infinite value. That's not nothing. That's everything." The celebration concluded with the release of hundreds of golden balloons, each carrying a message of hope or remembrance written by children from schools across the region. As the balloons drifted into the evening sky, Rusty, now very elderly but still energetic enough for special occasions, barked once at the sky, as if saying goodbye to his beloved Emma one more time. Detective Sarah Chun, watching from the edge of the crowd, felt the weight of 13 years finally lift from her shoulders. The case that had defined her career was closed, but its impact would continue for generations. Emma Hartley had been gone for 13 years, but her story would live on, protecting other children, comforting other families, and reminding everyone who heard it that some mysteries are worth waiting a lifetime to solve. As the last balloon disappeared into the darkening sky, Sarah made a silent promise to Emma and to all the other victims whose cases still filled her filing cabinets. She would never stop looking, never stop hoping, never stop believing that even the coldest case could eventually find its way to the light. 10 years had now passed since Daniel Caro's conviction, and the ripple effects of Emma's story continued to spread. The little girl who had vanished while walking her dog on that October evening in 2011 had finally come home. And in coming home, she had shown her community, her family, and everyone who worked to find her that love truly is eternal. That hope never completely dies. And that sometimes the most important answers are worth waiting for, no matter how long it takes. Emma Hartley's legacy was no longer just a story of tragedy, but a testament to the power of persistence, the importance of community, and the unbreakable bonds between a child and her dog. In death, she had become more than she could have imagined in life: a protector of children, a healer of families, and a reminder that even in the darkest of mysteries, love and justice can ultimately prevail.